So, historians have long used Responsa, Shelot v'Tshuvot, as a source for Jewish history. However, the social history of Responsa, i.e. how queries were presented to scholars, and what was done with the subsequent rulings in context of the specific case in which the question was posed, received much less attention. Heuristically, we can distinguish between Responsa as a social institution, who is asking the question, how a question is submitted, how it is answered, and how is the answer put to use, and Responsa as a literary tradition, how a Responsa becomes a part of a Responsa collection, and what is its life as a literary text. My talk today is part of a larger project that tries to do two things. First, to understand Responsa as a social institution in medieval Egypt, and second, to situate this practice within the broader historical transformation from the Gaonic period to that of the Rishonim. Due to the limitations of time, I will focus in my talk today on the practice in Egypt, but I will be happy to outline the larger transformation in the question period. Similarly, I will focus today on how Responsa were obtained, leaving what was done with the answer for another occasion. And even with all these sort of limitings of the subject, it's still a very large topic. So I will only attempt to offer today some chapter headings and sort of, points. For the same reason, I will not have time to give a lot of examples as I would like. And I've tried to make up for it by the handout that you received that contains a lot of examples. And I will refer to it, but not sort of read out each example detail. You can take it home with you and use it as a cure for insomnia. So I'm interested in the social history of Responsa for three reasons. First of all, Responsa is probably the most voluminous genre in Jewish legal writings. But the familiarity, longevity, and the sheer size of the literary genre give Responsa a sense of naturalness that obscured the local particularities of the social institutions. So for me, focusing on the social institution of Responsa in a particular time and place is a way for me to pierce through the literary tradition and examine how a legal process works as a social institution. The second reason is that Responsa is a wonderful example for a legal institution that is driven by litigant action. I've long been interested in what Daniel Lord Smale has termed the consumption of justice, i.e. the role of litigants' choices in the workings of the legal system. So looking at how Jews obtain Responsa allows me to recover litigants' agency in a field that often highlights the top-bottom function of the judge, the court, the state. To give just a taste of what I mean, and this is number 2 in your handout on the other side of the big diagram, a mother wrote a letter from Alexandria to her son in FUSTAT, and among other matters she writes, I have delayed the giving of judgment, i.e. the giving of judgment in court, until you bring me a fatwa from the Rais about what should be done. So the mother was involved in an ongoing litigation in the court of Alexandria, yet was able to delay the proceeding so that her son can obtain a ruling, probably from the head of the Jews in Fustat, that she hoped would turn the scale to her favor. So we see here the surprising ability of a woman to control the progress of the legal proceedings. The final reason I'm interested in the social history of Responsa is that looking at how litigants exercise their social capital to influence the legal arena reveals the degree to which the legal arena was embedded in the social fabric of the Jewish community and highlights an important aspect of the nature of justice in medieval Egypt. So the two main sources for the practice of the Responsa are the Responsa themselves, those that are found in the Genizah and those that are found outside of it, and the correspondence in the Genizah about Responsa. So, letters that mention Responsa. And, so when it comes to Responsa themselves, we are lucky to have the numerous erudite studies of Professor Friedman. And rather than trying to summarize his many discoveries, I will simply point out several points that I learned that I think that are, from his studies, that are crucial in the understanding of the practice of Responsa. First of all, Responsa and the Genizah exhibit substantial informality. Now I know that there are those here that are critical of using the formal-informal dichotomy, but I find it very useful in describing the fact that Responsa do not follow a rigid format. Sure, there are formal queries with their Reubens and Simons and Rachels and what does our rabbi say regarding. However, we also find legal queries presented in court documents and private correspondence to the point that it is often hard to decide whether we are really dealing with a responsive at all. Is it just a question, or is it really a legal response? In my own opinion, I also think that the line between responsa and petition could be quite blurry, and there was an exchange of formulas between the two genres. Second, Friedman showed different ways legal actors can manipulate responsa to their advantage. This could be done by asking the same authority several questions in search of the best approach to take later in court. This could be done by shopping for a favorable responsum, by submitting similar questions to several different scholars, or by amending the question so that it would result in a favorable ruling. The informality of responsa and the different ways of using them made responsa a useful resource for litigants in their interaction with the local court. Now, when I turn to Genizah correspondence dealing with responsa, in other words, letters in which people ask or report about the submitting of queries to legal authorities, the first thing that is immediately noticeable is that the discussion of responsa is inextricably mixed with other matters. So not only responsa do not adhere to a single format, but their mention in letters is often mixed with personal and commercial matters. I.e., one moment a writer is describing his business dealings, and the next he asks the recipient to help him obtain an answer to a query. I will present an example of this later in my talk. Am I going too fast? Okay. The mixture of personal, commercial, and legal matters in Genizah correspondence may not be so remarkable, right? It's a feature of Genizah correspondence. What is remarkable, I think, is the role of middlemen in the mechanism of obtaining responsa. Most questioners that we know of do not approach the respondent directly with a question, but send the written question to a middleman who will approach the respondent in person. The role of this middleman would have gone unnoticed if we had only the text of the responsa themselves. So this is something that we learned in the letters talking about responsa, not from the responsa themselves. And rather than inundating you with one example after the other, I've prepared this diagram that you see before you in the handout that summarizes 19 such cases. I have more examples, but there was limited so much I could comment the page. If Marina, when she gets confused, does a table, I do a diagram. So on the left you have the questioners, and on the right you have the respondents. In the middle, and also on the left, you have the middleman, marked with a circle. Since in some occasions we are not sure whether a person is a questioner or a middleman working for him, I mark those unclear cases with a square with round corners. The arrows in the diagram, this is important, I will come back to it, are the stage in which the stage in the process represented by the Genizah letter in our hand. And the dashed line are stages we can infer from the Genizah letter. I've noted down the location and profession of each person when they're known, and when there are Genizah celebrities like Harav, Yudah Cohen ben Yosef, Narai ben Nisim, or Maimonides, I added also that information. The cases are ordered chronologically, grouped according with Roman numerals, and there is a legend on the back of the page that gives you the shelf mark and the period for each group. Okay, so the first thing we learn from the diagram is the centrality of middlemen to the institution of responsa. They appear in the great majority of the cases, and sometimes there is more than one middleman involved. Second, we learn something about who these middlemen are. They're usually communal officials, cantors, court clerks, and judges, as well as established merchants. The middlemen are living in the city of the respondent, which allows them to come in person to the respondent and present the matter. Third, and this is I think particularly important, we see that both litigants and judges use middlemen to approach the respondent. This point requires some explanation. So usually people think of responsa as questions of judges faced with a difficult case that demand either the legal expertise or the halachic authority of the respondent. However, we know from Genizah and from Maimonides' responsa that many, maybe even most, of the questions, I'm talking here about questions that are arising out of conflicts. I'm not talking today about academic responsa or ritual responsa, right? Questions about ritual. I'm talking about specific sort of cases of dispute between people. So we know that many, if not most of the questions were composed by litigants or by their supporters. Now I admit that when I first became interested in the role of middlemen, I thought that what I will discover is that judges turn directly to the respondent. After all, these respondents were often people that nominated them, while litigants use middleman to disguise the fact that the question originated from one of the parties of the dispute. Okay, so I use a middleman to disguise the fact that the question comes from a litigant. To my surprise, however, we see that local judges seeking an answer from a legal authority in the capital also used middlemen. For example, line 3 and line 9 in the diagram. So the role of middlemen in the practice of responsa was pervasive. Okay, so now I will return to the diagram later, but I want to give a taste of the text of the letters and through them see the nature of the relationship between questioners, middlemen, and respondents. So in the beginning of the 13th century, a certain Yefet ben Khalfon wrote a letter to Elijah ben Zechariah, the Jewish judge in FUSTAT. The text and the original are example number 3a. Okay? So, the lowliest slave, Yefet ben Khalfon, kisses the ground before the seat of Rabbi Elijah, the great judge. I inform you that I am long needing to see the happy face, I should have said, in yearning to execute any need the Lord has. I am asking the forgiveness from the Lord on the account of the woolen shawl that you commanded me to buy. For I visited the market several times on its account and on the account of the hooded cloaks as well. But I could not find something suiting for the Lord. However, God willing, I will not neglect the need of the Lord until it reaches me. The slave asked from the favor of the Lord that he will show our excellent Lord, a lot of lords here, Abraham the Nagid, this fatwa. After he will honor it with his lofty handwriting. This, by the way, is a motif that comes in a lot. The questioner wants the response of the respondent in his own hand. And it's a parallel also in Islamic responsa. And if you look at the Adab al-Mufti works in this Islamic tradition, you see them instructing respondent to answer in their own hand and on the same piece of paper, which is interesting. Favor your slave by sending it with whoever heads in my direction. I ask this by way of relying on the kindness of the Lord. Peace. Whatever need the Lord has entrusted to his slave. So this letter shows a mixture of the commercial, legal, and personal matters that I mentioned before. Moreover, I see that the request from the judge to show the query to Abraham Maimonides is not simply placed alongside the promise to fulfill any need the judge has. There is a reciprocal relationship between them. Yeah? Yefet promises to fulfill Elijah's request concerning shawls and cloaks, and he requests that Elijah present the query to Abraham Maimonides and obtain an answer. But beyond reciprocity, the letter is saturated with the language of patron-client relationships. Terms like favor, ni'mah, kindness, fadl, fulfillment of need, haja, are familiar from the studies of Mark Cohen and Marina Rostov on patronage. Thus, obtaining a response from Abraham Maimonides was not simply Elijah's responsibility due to his office as a judge, but it was a social benefaction that he could bestow upon the questioner. Such benefaction necessitated recuperation, here the promise to fulfill the middleman's need. It matters less when the woolen shawl is equal in value, if there is a value, to obtaining a response. What is important is the maintenance of the relationship and the promise of future loyalty and cooperation. The handout contains text of 2 further examples of letter asking middleman to obtain a ruling that shows similar features. These are number 3b and c. I'm not going to talk to them. 3b and 3c. I'm not going to talk to them about it. So the involvement of middleman in responsa needs to be understood in the context of the Islamic ethos of intermediacy and intercession, shafa. And here I would like to thank Marina Rostov for setting me off on the intercession path. So intercession is a way of bridging a social gap through an intermediary. At the same time, it is also a way of enacting and therefore proclaiming this gap. In responsa, this meant that the questioner felt that their queries stood a better chance of being answered when presented via a local middleman, enjoying a personal acquaintance with the respondent. The middleman honors the respondent by presenting the query in a face-to-face meeting. We saw a hint of that yesterday. He submits the written text, however. He submits a written text. However, it is clear that he adds information beyond what is written. So I put several examples of this as number 4 in the handout. I'm not going to talk about it. But thereby we see that the practice of responsa mixes written and oral components, which are hidden from us in the literary form of the responsa. And it is also, this mixture of oral and written is an important feature of intercession in Islamic culture. We can talk about that. So by employing ties of patronage with the intercessor, the questioner is able to use his social capital to obtain a positive result in the legal arena. At the same time, from the perspective of the respondents, the use of middlemen allowed them to limit and control access to themselves, thus distancing them from the questioners. So middlemen also served as a protective buffer, allowing the respondent to choose whether to answer, delay, or ignore questions. If we look at the diagram again, we see that almost all of our documentations come from the questioner-middleman leg of the process. Because the middleman lived in the same city of the respondent and approached him in person, this leg of the process did not produce documentation and is hidden from view, both our view as historians, but also from the view of the people at the time. Indeed, in some letters, we see the questioners asking the middleman to keep the responsa a secret, so they can be brandished out at the most effective moment. Thus, this means that we see ties of patronage between the questioner and the middleman, but that is where it stops. The mechanism of responsa hides the interaction between the middleman and the respondents, and therefore protects the integrity of the institution. I think that this double role of intermediacy, on the one hand permitting the use of social capital in the legal arena, and on the other hand protecting the respondents, was an important reason for the success of the system. Okay, so I'm going to start to conclude. There are many different directions that the social history of responsa can be pursued further. There is the comparison with the Gaonic origins that I mentioned before, and there is the comparison with contemporary Islamic responsa. There are many other directions, but of all these different paths, I would like to say something about how the study of responsa as a social institution fits within my general understanding of the legal arena in medieval Egypt. So even in this all too short excursion on social practices surrounding responsa, two major features stand out. The first is the agency of the litigants. Much of our evidence testified to the ability of individuals to maneuver the legal arena and manipulate its institutions. And it was the actions of litigants who wanted to obtain an edge over their rivals that served as the engine of the institution of responsa, and in general, I would argue, the broader legal arena. The second, it is the degree to which this legal arena was embedded within the social fabric of Jewish communities, with social relationships, patronage, and intercession playing a central role in the working of justice. These features are closely interconnected, of course, because the central part of litigants' agency was the ability to use the social capital in the legal arena. Okay, so in a classic study, Bourdieu presented the force of the juridical field as stemming from the separateness and the otherness from the rest of social life. We respect lawyers because we think they have this kind of special realm. We respect judges because they're removed from society. Genizah documents show us a very different model of justice. The force of the Jewish legal institution in medieval Egypt stemmed not from being separate from Jewish life, from social life, but from being embedded within it. Jews in medieval Egypt had options. For example, they could use Muslim legal institutions that had greater powers of coercion. So why did Jews use Jewish institutions in substantial numbers, as Genizah documents testify? Part of the answer, of course, as people in this room has argued, was that Jews wanted to use Jewish courts, Jewish documents, and Jewish law. But another part of the answer was that Jewish legal institutions were not foreign institutions, but were familiar and accessible. Because they were embedded within the social fabric, Jews could employ in them social capital to a greater degree than they could in a Muslim legal institution. So there was a delicate balance. On the one hand, Jews tried to influence legal proceedings through social relationships. On the other hand, legal proceedings were often focused on getting litigants to a mediated compromise, as we heard yesterday. And once you use your social capital in a legal institution, you're also invested in it. So the courts use the same social relationships in order to pressure litigants to compromise and adhere to past agreements. So in the juridical bazaar of medieval Islam, to use Uri Simonson's wonderful phrase, in order to be competitive, Jewish legal institutions had to be accessible and open. Being embedded in the social arena encouraged Jews to make use of these institutions, while at the same time gave these institutions social force. It was through their structural weakness, the fact that they didn't have strong coercive powers, that Jewish legal institutions found remarkable strength and vitality. Jewish justice in medieval Egypt was not blind, but it was familiar and deeply personal. Thank you.
Thank you, Oded. have time for a few questions before we so please.
I'll give the first word to Mordechai.
Professor, please.
Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful, interesting paper. I just add a footnote to the intermediary who interceded for Shafar. I assume you're familiar with, or I mentioned Yehuda Halevi's letter to Chalfon, in which he requests, Yehuda Halevi requests Chalfon to serve as his agent, informal agent, in requesting Responsa from Kibbutz Migash at the behalf that had been requested by Jews in Toledo, because Yehuda Halevi writes, I'm embarrassed to admit to them that I cannot do a shafar. And at this point, Chalfon was closer to Ibn Migash than Yehuda Halevi. Another footnote, I know you're familiar with my recent article on fatwa. I just call attention to other students here who might want to look at the letters to the 3A, 2 lines before the end, in which 3 or 4 lines before the end of the translation, in which the writer asks Yefet to show Abraham and Maimonides this fatwa, where it means query, and people. I know you're aware of that. Calling your attention to go. Right.
Yeah. I left it in fatwa because I think sometimes it's good to see that they're also using the Arabic term for this. But yes, you're right. It's a query.
Right.
And to draw on what you're saying, I didn't mention the Yehuda Halevi and Chalfon just because I was focusing on medieval Egypt, but intercession is a much, much broader subject in Islamic culture. I would also say that the way that both Anatoly and Yosef ibn Shimon, the way that they sort of, when they came to Egypt and they wrote these sort of literary pieces to introduce themselves to Maimonides is also a form of shafa. It's a cultural shafa.
I don't remember other documents in which one writes another, and
yes,
with such a statement that I could not succeed with my shafa'a and perhaps you would do that for me, and I'm embarrassed.
Yeah, you're right. I did not find the actual term shafa'a used. You're right. This is the one case. Marina?
So this is brilliant, not in the devalued British sense. And actually, I mean, you enlightened me also about some of the mechanisms of shafa'a and especially the oral component, which is very interesting. I wanted to make a suggestion about in your own handwriting request. I think it goes beyond the parallel with fatwa, with Islamic fatwa, and it's actually an administrative thing, because whenever you see copies of decrees, they're always very careful to write that there was an alama, the signature of the caliph, in the lofty hand or in the noble hand, khat al-yad al-sharif or al-ali. There's a kind of authorization function, and also I think a fetishization of the actual handwriting of the person in authority. And you know, the imam is after all like giving a fatwa in a way by signing off on a decree. So that's another parallel.
I also thought of it as an object. I wonder if afterwards it was kept because, you know, Ktav could show, you know, people have like this kind of sense, you know.
Pushing that back, then yeah.
Thank you for your lecture. According to you, Jews that wanted to go to the court had the opportunity to choose between the Muslim court or the Jewish court, and because of that, you mentioned a lot of implication about it. I'm not sure that in reality this was the case, because as far as he stayed as a Jew, he had to get to be in the community. He had to get religious services. And I'm not sure that he could, and because of that, I'm not sure that the court could be, according to your implication, much not rigid as it could imagine. So I think that in reality, it didn't have so much opportunity.
Okay, so the answer to that is, I mean, in a sense, simple. In reality, we see many, many Jews going to Muslim courts. We have this both on the fact that there are so many Muslim legal records found in the Genizah, and letters mention it often. Also, to remind us what Goitan said in his famous article on the interplay of law.
One minute, but you have to look in what cases they went. Maybe in the cases that they went to the Muslim court, it didn't affect their interrelationship in the community.
Well, first of all, we see the heads of the community turning to Muslim courts all the time. We also have, you also have to remember, this is Goitan in the famous article on the interplay of law, that he says the Jewish courts were part of the Islamic State. The Muslim state considered the Jews as part of the justice. So it wasn't, and the Jewish courts also derived their power, when they needed to, from the state. So there couldn't have been very strong penalization, social penalization for a person using, and we know, sometimes when you do the deal of sale, you had it both in the Jewish court and in the Muslim court. It was a standard procedure. You're right. I presented it as if it's a free-for-all, but it's not a free-for-all because there are, for example, status issue definitely matters.
There's a chayrim.
And there was a chayrim, yeah. So, but we know that the reality was that a lot of people turned.
Yes. There, back.
Thank you for providing explicit evidence for the middleman. In reading the Maimonides Responsa, you get a lot of evidence, of implicit evidence, where you always have a middleman asking and speaking about a theoretical case or a case. And you can see that it's not the litigant speaking, it's the middleman speaking. So the middleman must be very pervasive custom in these kind of cases. I just wonder why that is. Why do you think that it is the case? Why don't they come directly to the to the court? Why did they come directly? So most of these were almost all of them were indirect.
The problem is with the written. First of all, when I say middleman, there's also the question. Sometimes I wonder where the judge. Some questions were written by the judge, but I think I explained why they use middlemen. Part of it is there is a sort of etiquette involved, and because I think you use the word
it's a question of access.
It's a question of access. Certain people had access to Maimonides, and you know that if I write the question, it's he's not going to look at it. But if somebody gives it to him,
so is it because they didn't have the legal language to express it? Because today we find that happens very often. We need to have somebody to express it in legal terms.
Usually the middleman already receives the written. There's different stages. So when I talk about the questioner, I already sort of envision the question already been written, and that's also probably involved somebody with legal expertise writing the question. So it's not just the litigant writing the question; he's probably turning to somebody who has some sort of legal expertise. The middleman, we also know that middlemen sometimes change the text. But so there is an issue of legal expertise, but there's also all sorts of other cultural matters. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, first of all, and continuation of this conversation. I think we came from a basic and characteristic phenomenon, social phenomenon, and it's beyond the legal scene. The use of middlemen, and I would like to go back to my book on Alexandria, when I found that actually there's no interaction that remains confined to two persons. There are always middlemen, be it in court or in trade or wherever. And I would say that it's the way the elite tries to overcome the shortages of communication, because they couldn't really spread emails all around. And in order to keep an elite aware of the to keep its its solidarity. It must always involve as many people as possible. So whenever anything is any social act is done, so as many people as possible are being involved, and I believe it is on purpose to keep them really inside the group.
I completely agree, and we had I think a conversation like this before. I would say yes, it's the elite, and there's always people, the act of bringing more people together, but it's also how the elite is connected to people in lower sort of strata through these networks. You see what I mean?
Last question.
Just a footnote to your question, Dov. It wasn't an issue of going to the court and asking, because here we're referring not to judges, but to jurisconsults, poskim, muftim. Maimonides was not a judge, so it's a question of access to the whoever borei halacha, jurisconsult, rather than going to. As far as handwriting, it was, of course, this was very important, as you mentioned. We're familiar with the Maimonides. He's not unique. Signature V'chatav Moshe, which means written in my own hand by me in my own hand. And this is found also in Arabic papyri, wakataba, somebody did, or whether the witness or whoever signed by his own hand. And we have a note by Anatoly who asks Maimonides to add his father's name, because in Sicily they're not familiar with his short signature, V'chatav Moshe, who it is. I'm afraid we're really out of time.